My parents didn't notice I had moved to another state for 8 months because they were too busy obsessing over my golden child brother Ryan, who had just spectacularly failed at his third business venture and needed them to bail him out of $30,000 in debt. While I was building a successful consulting firm in Denver, working 16-hour days to establish myself in a competitive market, sleeping on an air mattress for the first 3 months, because I'd invested every penny into my own business, my parents were sending Ryan money for his latest get-rich-quick scheme and telling everyone how entrepreneurial he was. When my mother finally called me, it wasn't to ask how I was doing or whether I was okay living alone in a new city. It was to demand that I drop everything and help them move furniture for Ryan, because apparently his latest girlfriend had kicked him out and he needed to move back in with them, again. "Ethan, honey, I need you to swing by the house this weekend," she said, as if I lived around the corner instead of 1,200 miles away. "Ryan's going through a tough time and we need all hands on deck to support him." That's when I realized I had the power to give them exactly what they'd been giving me my entire life: complete indifference. But this time, I'd be the one calling the shots, and they'd finally understand what it felt like to be invisible. To understand how we got to this point, you need to know about the golden child system that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. Ryan, 3 years younger than me, had been positioned as the family star from the day he was born. Every failure was reframed as a learning experience, every bad decision was explained away as youthful exploration, and every crisis became an opportunity for our parents to prove their unconditional love. His first business venture was a food truck that lasted 6 months before he gave up because the location wasn't right. Mom and Dad covered the $15,000 in losses and told everyone how proud they were that he was willing to take risks. His second business was a dropshipping company that folded when he realized he actually had to work more than a few hours a week. They paid off another $8,000 in debts and praised his entrepreneurial spirit. When his third business, some kind of cryptocurrency consulting firm, collapsed under the weight of his complete lack of expertise, they didn't just bail him out financially. They moved him back into his childhood bedroom, paid his car insurance, covered his credit card bills, and started referring to this period as his transition phase. Ryan could do no wrong even when he did everything wrong. Meanwhile, I had spent my entire academic career trying to earn even a fraction of the attention they showered on Ryan. Perfect grades throughout high school meant nothing when they were displayed next to Ryan's participation trophies. A full scholarship to a state university was dismissed as nice but not as impressive as Ryan's acceptance to that private school, the one they were paying $40,000 a year for and which he eventually dropped out of. When I graduated summa cum laude and landed a good job at a consulting firm, the family dinner conversation was dominated by Ryan's latest get-rich-quick scheme. When I got promoted to senior consultant after just 2 years, they spent 10 minutes congratulating me and 2 hours discussing Ryan's new business idea that could really be the one this time. My achievements were background noise to their obsession. The breaking point came when I decided to start my own business and asked if I could present my business plan to the family. I had spent months researching the market, developing financial projections, and creating a comprehensive strategy for launching a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses optimize their operations. I got exactly 12 minutes of their attention before Ryan called with another crisis that needed immediate intervention. While I was explaining my 5-year growth plan, they were already reaching for their checkbooks to solve whatever problem their golden child brother had created this time. They told me to be realistic while funding Ryan's fantasies. The opportunity that would change everything came 6 months after that disastrous business plan presentation. A former colleague from my consulting firm had moved to Denver to start his own company and offered me a senior position with equity and the chance to eventually branch out on my own. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a chance to build something meaningful in a place where my success wouldn't be overshadowed by my golden child brother's latest crisis. The decision to move felt like the most natural thing in the world. For years, I'd been trying to prove myself to a family that had already decided I wasn't worth their full attention. Denver represented freedom from that dynamic, a place where I could succeed or fail based on my own merit rather than how I compared to Ryan's endless need for rescue. I decided to see if they'd actually miss me. When I told my parents about the Denver opportunity over dinner, I expected some kind of reaction. maybe concern about the distance, questions about my plans, or even basic interest in this major life change. Instead, I got a distracted, "That's nice, honey," from my mother and a grunt of acknowledgement from my father before the conversation immediately pivoted back to Ryan's latest scheme to start a social media marketing agency with absolutely no experience in marketing. 10 minutes into my explanation of the career opportunity, Ryan called with what he described as an emergency. He'd gotten into a fender bender and needed them to come deal with the insurance situation immediately. My parents jumped up from the dinner table like the house was on fire, grabbing their coats and keys while barely making eye contact with me. "We'll talk more about this later," Mom said already halfway out the door. "Good luck with whatever you decide." They said good luck like I was going to the store. Moving to Denver turned out to be the best decision I'd ever made, and it proved wrong every prediction my family had made about my chances of success. They'd told me to be realistic about starting my own business, that consulting was oversaturated, and that I'd probably be back home within a year asking for financial help just like Ryan always did. Instead, my consulting work took off immediately. My first major client was a mid-sized manufacturing company that needed help streamlining their operations, and when I helped them reduce costs by 22% in the first quarter, word spread quickly through Denver's business community. Within 6 months, I had enough steady clients to sign a lease on my own office space, a small but professional suite in a downtown building with mountain views. Revenue was growing every month. I was building the kind of professional reputation I'd always known I was capable of achieving, and I was doing it all without a single dollar of family support. Meanwhile, Ryan was on his fourth failed business venture and had moved back in with our parents, again. My own business was thriving without their input. The communication pattern with my family revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. What used to be weekly phone calls became every 2 weeks, then every 3 weeks, then just whenever they needed something from me. The conversations themselves were even more telling. They'd spend maybe 3 minutes asking how I was doing before launching into detailed updates about Ryan's latest struggles. When they called after 5 weeks of silence in March, it was to ask if I could co-sign a loan for Ryan's latest venture because his credit was temporarily compromised. When they called 6 weeks later in May, it was to see if I knew anything about business insurance because Ryan was having some complications with his social media marketing firm. In July, after 7 weeks without contact, they called to ask for my opinion on whether Ryan should file for bankruptcy or try to work out payment plans with his creditors. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were calling their unrealistic son for business advice to help their entrepreneurial son who couldn't keep a venture running for more than 6 months. They called when they needed something, never to check in. What struck me most was that in all those months, they never once asked about my business success, my growing client base, or whether I was happy with my new life. They didn't know I'd hired my first employee or that I'd been featured in a local business magazine. They had no idea I'd bought a house or that I was dating someone I'd met through my professional network. The emotional freedom that came with this distance was something I'd never experienced before. I wasn't constantly braced for the next Ryan crisis that would dominate family conversation for weeks. I wasn't watching my achievements get minimized because they didn't involve the kind of drama that my parents seemed to mistake for ambition. I could focus on my own goals without worrying about whether my success was making my golden child brother look bad by comparison. The absence of their chaos was like finally getting a good night's sleep after years of insomnia. For the first time in years, I felt free. While I was building my consulting business and enjoying my newfound freedom in Denver, Ryan's world was collapsing in spectacular fashion back home. His social media marketing agency, the one that had interrupted my moving announcement at dinner, had not only failed but had left him facing potential lawsuits from clients who'd paid up front for services he'd never delivered. According to the increasingly frantic updates I received during those rare family phone calls, Ryan had convinced several small business owners to pay him thousands of dollars each for comprehensive marketing campaigns. The problem was that Ryan knew absolutely nothing about social media marketing beyond posting selfies on Instagram. When the clients realized their money had essentially disappeared and their businesses hadn't seen a single new customer, they started demanding refunds and threatening legal action. The debts were mounting faster than my parents could pay them off. Ryan owed $23,000 to former clients, another $15,000 in unpaid business expenses, and his personal credit cards were maxed out from trying to fund the agency's operations. This wasn't the kind of small financial crisis my parents could quietly handle with a quick check. This was a full-scale disaster that threatened to drag the whole family down. Even golden children eventually hit rock bottom. My parents' response to this crisis revealed just how far they were willing to go to protect their favored son. They'd already maxed out their own credit cards trying to pay off Ryan's immediate debts. I learned from my aunt that they were seriously considering taking out a second mortgage on their house, the house they'd nearly finished paying off after 30 years, to cover Ryan's legal obligations. The stress was taking a physical toll on them, too. My mother had developed chronic insomnia and was taking anxiety medication for the first time in her life. My father, who'd always prided himself on his financial stability, was talking about postponing his retirement indefinitely to deal with the costs of cleaning up Ryan's mess. What amazed me was that even as they struggled with these massive problems, they still talked as if this was just another temporary setback that would eventually resolve itself. They discussed Ryan's next opportunity and his plans to rebuild his reputation as if he hadn't just defrauded multiple small business owners and created a legal nightmare for the entire family. They were running out of ways to save him. The most telling part of this whole crisis was how they still assumed I was sitting at home, ready and available to help solve whatever problems arose. When they called asking for business advice about Ryan's legal troubles, they talked about maybe getting together this weekend to go over his options, and suggested I could drop by Sunday afternoon to look at the paperwork. They made casual references to local restaurants we could meet at mentioned events happening in town that I might be interested in attending, and asked if I could swing by the bank with Dad to co-sign some document related to Ryan's debt consolidation. Every conversation included the underlying assumption that I was still part of their local support network, still living the same life I'd been living before, still available to be drafted into service whenever my golden child brother created another crisis. They still thought I was their backup plan. The moment of truth finally came that Tuesday evening when my mother called asking for what she assumed would be a simple local favor. She needed me to swing by the house that weekend to help move furniture for Ryan, who was finally being forced to face some consequences for his failed business ventures. What she didn't expect was for me to tell her I couldn't help because I lived 1,200 miles away. The silence that followed my explanation was so long I actually wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small and confused in a way I'd never heard before. "Wait, what do you mean, you moved to Denver? When did that happen?" 8 months ago, Mom. I told you about the job offer, remember? We talked about it at dinner, but then Ryan called with his car accident emergency and you had to leave." More silence. I could practically hear the gears turning as she tried to process this information. 8 months, 2/3 of a year. An entire winter and spring and half a summer, and they literally hadn't noticed I was gone. But you've been calling us back when we needed advice about Ryan's business problems. We just talked last month about the bankruptcy thing. Yeah, I've been calling you back from Denver, from my office in Denver, from the house I bought in Denver. 8 months and they literally didn't notice. After that phone call, I did something I'd never done before. I gathered evidence of the pattern that had defined my relationship with my family my entire life. I went through boxes of old school records, achievement certificates, and correspondence that I'd saved over the years, not because I was sentimental, but because somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd always known this moment might come. The high school report cards showing straight A's every semester, never once acknowledged or celebrated because they coincided with Ryan's participation in various sports teams. The acceptance letter from the university where I'd earned my business degree, which had been mentioned exactly once at a family dinner before the conversation shifted to Ryan's decision to change his major for the third time. The letter from my first employer offering me a promotion and a significant raise, which I'd excitedly shared with my parents, only to have them respond with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before launching into a 40-minute discussion about Ryan's latest business idea. The certificate from the professional development course I'd completed on my own time and my own dime to improve my consulting skills, something that never came up in family conversation once. The newspaper clipping from when my college had featured me in an alumni newsletter for my early career success, which I'd mailed to my parents and never heard a word about. The invitation to speak at a business conference that I'd mentioned during a phone call, only to be interrupted by news of Ryan's latest financial crisis. The evidence of neglect filled an entire folder, but what felt even more powerful was the documentation of what I'd accomplished entirely on my own, without their support, encouragement, or even awareness. The business registration documents for my consulting firm filed with the state of Colorado and showing me as the sole proprietor of a legally recognized entity. The tax returns from my first year of operation documenting revenue that exceeded what Ryan had ever generated from any of his ventures, despite getting constant financial support from our parents. The signed contracts with major clients who trusted me to help optimize their business operations. Relationships I'd built through competence and reliability rather than family connections or bailout money. The lease agreement for my downtown office space, a professional environment that I'd earned through my own work, rather than inherited or been given as a safety net. The before and after photos of that office space, showing how I'd transformed it from an empty suite into a functional business headquarters with my own money and my own vision. The business bank statements showing consistent growth month after month, profit margins that any entrepreneur would envy, and financial stability that I'd created without asking my parents for a single dollar. The professional headshots I'd had taken for my business website and marketing materials showing a confident, successful person who'd built something meaningful from nothing. The testimonials from satisfied clients praising my work and recommending my services to other business owners. My success spoke louder than their silence ever could. Once the shock of discovering I'd moved to Denver wore off, my parents' approach to communication changed dramatically. The casual Ryan-focused phone calls were replaced by urgent, tearful conversations where they suddenly needed advice about everything from bankruptcy law to debt consolidation strategies. My mother, who had barely asked about my life for the past 8 months, was now calling twice a week with detailed updates about their deteriorating financial situation. The sob story was always the same: Ryan was facing serious legal consequences, they'd exhausted their savings trying to help him, and they were running out of options. The guilt trips came next. How family was supposed to support each other during difficult times, how they'd always been there for me when I needed them, how disappointed they were that I seemed so unwilling to help during their darkest hour. What they couldn't seem to understand was that their darkest hour was entirely self-created and had been decades in the making. Suddenly, they needed their backup plan, son. When it became clear that emotional manipulation wasn't going to work over the phone, I decided to establish some very specific boundaries around any help I might be willing to provide. If they wanted my assistance with their financial crisis, they would need to treat it as a business consultation, not a family obligation. I offered to meet with them for exactly 2 hours to review their situation and provide recommendations, but only if they were willing to come to Denver to my office during my business hours. No family dinners, no emotional appeals, no attempts to recreate the old dynamic where I was expected to drop everything to solve problems created by their golden child brother's poor decisions. I would review their financial documents, provide professional advice about their options, and offer specific recommendations for moving forward. But I would not be writing any checks, co-signing any loans, or accepting any responsibility for cleaning up the mess they'd created through years of enabling Ryan's destructive behavior. Help would come on my terms, not theirs. The response to my conditions was immediate and predictable. My mother started crying and accused me of being cold and businesslike toward my own family. My father complained that I was making this harder than it needs to be, and suggested that I was punishing them for Ryan's mistakes. When emotional manipulation from my parents failed, they recruited extended family members to pressure me. My aunt called to tell me how hurt my parents were by my selfish attitude and how important it was for families to stick together during tough times. My uncle sent a long email about forgiveness and family loyalty, completely ignoring the fact that there was nothing for me to forgive. I was simply refusing to enable the same destructive pattern that had defined my entire childhood. The most pathetic attempt came when Ryan himself called, apparently coached by our parents, to deliver what sounded like a rehearsed apology for his behavior and a plea for me to help the family get through this crisis. He actually had the audacity to suggest that his business failures were just learning experiences, and that with my help he could get back on track and make everyone proud. Guilt trips don't work on someone who's already left. When my parents finally flew to Denver for our scheduled meeting, the power dynamic was immediately and unmistakably clear. They walked into my professional office suite on the 20th floor, looking around nervously at the mountain views, the polished conference table, and the framed certificates on the wall. This wasn't their house where they'd always controlled the conversation and set the agenda around Ryan's needs. This was my territory, my business, my rules. I watched them take in the reality of what I'd built, the success they'd never bothered to ask about, the professional environment I'd created entirely without their support or guidance. My assistant had offered them coffee and directed them to the conference room, treating them exactly like any other clients who'd come seeking business consultation. The transformation in their demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the dismissive attitude they'd always had toward my career ambitions. Gone were the casual assumptions about my availability and priorities. They sat in the chairs across from my desk like people who finally understood that they were no longer in control of this relationship. This was my house, my rules, my terms. I started the meeting by laying out exactly what they'd missed during their 8 months of complete inattention to my life. The folder of evidence I'd compiled told a story that was impossible to ignore or explain away. Every report card they'd never celebrated, every achievement they'd dismissed, every milestone they'd overlooked, in favor of Ryan's latest crisis. Let's start with high school, I said, spreading out the documents methodically. 4 years of straight A's, perfect attendance. Honor roll every semester. Do you remember congratulating me for any of this? I watched them shift uncomfortably as they looked at the evidence of their own indifference. The letters from colleges offering scholarships that they'd barely acknowledged. The academic awards that had been handed out at ceremonies they'd missed because Ryan had a basketball game the same night. Here's my college acceptance letter. Full academic scholarship. Do you remember your response? I waited for an answer that didn't come. You said that's nice and then spent the rest of dinner talking about whether Ryan should major in business or communications. Document after document, achievement after achievement, year after year of systematic dismissal and neglect. The promotion letters from my first job that they'd responded to with distracted nods. The professional certifications I'd earned that never came up in family conversation. The business awards that had never made it onto their refrigerator next to Ryan's participation trophies. And this, I said, placing my business registration documents on the table, is what you missed while you were obsessing over Ryan's fourth failed venture, a legitimate, profitable business that I built entirely on my own. The pattern was impossible to deny anymore. When they tried to interrupt with excuses and justifications, I held up my hand and continued. This wasn't a discussion, it was a presentation of facts that would determine the future of our relationship. I'm willing to provide you with one consultation about your financial situation, I told them. I'll review your documents, analyze your options, and give you professional recommendations for dealing with Ryan's debt crisis. But I need you to understand the terms of any future relationship we might have. I pulled out a written list I'd prepared, treating this exactly like the business consultation it was. First, I will not be providing any financial assistance. No loans, no co-signing, no bailouts. Second, Ryan's problems are Ryan's responsibility. I will not be involved in any future rescue attempts or crisis management related to his poor decisions. My mother started to cry, but I continued without acknowledging the emotional manipulation I'd seen so many times before. Third, if you want to have a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on mutual respect and genuine interest in my life and achievements. I won't be accepting casual phone calls where I'm treated like a backup resource to be activated only when you need something. My father finally spoke up, his voice defensive. We've always been proud of your accomplishments, Ethan. You're being unfair. I pulled out the folder of evidence and pushed it across the table. The documentation says otherwise. 28 years of documented proof that my achievements were background noise to your obsession with Ryan's problems. But family is supposed to notice when someone moves to another state, I interrupted. Family is supposed to celebrate successes, not just manage crises. Family is supposed to be interested in each other's lives, not just use each other as resources when things go wrong. I leaned back in my chair and looked at them both directly. You had 28 years to be the kind of parents who deserved my loyalty and support. You chose to focus all your attention and resources on Ryan instead. Now I've built a life where I don't need your approval or support, and I'm not going back to being your backup plan. Too little too late doesn't repair decades of indifference. In the months that followed our Denver meeting, the consequences of decades of poor family priorities finally became clear to everyone involved. Ryan's legal troubles continued to mount, and without unlimited parental bailouts, he was forced to face the reality of his poor business decisions. My parents, financially and emotionally drained from years of enabling, found themselves with limited options and dwindling resources to address problems that had grown beyond their ability to fix. The contact between us became sporadic and formal. When they did call, it was usually to update me on their latest crisis or to ask for very specific advice that I would provide in brief professional consultations. The long rambling conversations about Ryan's potential and future opportunities had been replaced by terse discussions about debt management and bankruptcy proceedings. They finally understood what they'd lost. Meanwhile, my own business continued to thrive in ways that proved wrong every prediction they'd made about my unrealistic ambitions. Within a year of our confrontation, I'd expanded to hire 3 full-time consultants and had opened a second office to serve clients in the mountain region. The local business journal featured me in their 40 under 40 list, and I was invited to speak at several industry conferences about small business optimization strategies. The professional recognition felt satisfying, but not because it validated me in my parents' eyes. It felt good because it represented work. I was genuinely proud of success I'd earned through competence and dedication rather than family connections or rescue funding. My own business became everything they said it couldn't. More importantly, I discovered what life felt like without the constant weight of trying to earn attention and approval that would never come. I could focus on building relationships with people who valued my contributions, pursuing opportunities that excited me, and making decisions based on my own goals, rather than how they might affect the family's focus on Ryan's problems. The peace that came with that independence was unlike anything I'd experienced during 28 years of competing for second place in my own family. I felt free in a way I'd never experienced before.